So liberation has come and gone, and as expected, the wailing, the gnashing of teeth by the media, the left, and the nations affected by Trump's retaliatory tariffs was epic and something to behold.
Trump has just lobbed a stonking great stick of Semtex right into the foundations of the global economy. He has potentially ignited one of the biggest trade wars in living memory, and he has ripped up the United States' decade-long policy of promoting world free trade, and in its place is instituting one of the biggest steps towards protectionism that any US president has ever taken.
So are you tired of all the winning yet? Are you enjoying all of the greatness? Donald Trump just imposed an across-the-board, no exceptions, 10% tariff on Tokelau. Take that, Tokelau bandits. You will screw over the United States of America no longer.
You know, it amazes me how much the left is crying bloody murder over this, as is much of the mainstream media. It's like, how dare you put taxes on foreign nations who overtax us? We're just supposed to sit there and take it. But I have to point out that just because we never retaliated to unfair trade practices doesn't mean we have to just keep sitting here and taking it. And yet, the response from these clowns domestically is one of hysteria, saying it is unbelievable, it is horrible, and it needs to stop. Bad Donald Trump. But I have to ask, why should we continue to let the rest of the world put us over a barrel and steal from us without any kind of retribution? We've been doing this for decades. The media complains that it'll raise prices, and sure, in the short term that will likely happen. But the reality is our industries, our jobs have been decimated over the decades precisely because the rest of the world charges us so much more than we charge them. In fact, more than $1 trillion each year is lost to our so-called friends and enemies due to trade taxes and market manipulations. We used to be the world's industrial powerhouse before we gave it all away. Our nation's leaders allowed our country to become hollowed out. Not only did we allow endless, growing, and ever-consuming government bureaucracy to strangle our industries at home with their endless red tape, regulations, and fees, but the trade wars against the United States that were largely ignored by the ruling class and their willing accomplices in the media sped this decline along. I want to go over a few examples of this. So let's start with our dear friend, the communist empire China. And of course, I'm being sarcastic, as China has never ever been our friends. Now, they joined the WTO back in 2001, and they promised that they would be all about fair play. But of course, they were anything but. They used state subsidies to prop up their industries like steel and solar. For example, China's government pumps in $100 billion every year into key sectors, letting them dump goods well below costs. Let's take, for example, the steel industry. Thanks to China, our industry was brutally hurt. We went from producing 100 million tons in 1980 to 86 million tons by 2023. These is per year numbers. While China production has soared now to over 1 billion tons, they are now half the world's supply. Meanwhile, they charge us here in the US 20 to 30% tariff taxes on US goods like cars, while we have kept our taxes, our tariffs, at 2.5%, which is massively unfair for our domestic producers. Now, China also does currency manipulation. They keep the yen weak to boost exports, and it's a 1-2 punch. The United States has lost to China 2.4 million jobs since 1999 to the year 2011. This according to the Economic Policy Institute data. And these numbers are no joke. That's a lot of jobs to have been lost to overseas producers. So that's China. Then there's our friends, our so-called allies, like the EU, Canada, and Japan, who play nicer but still tilt the board deeply in their direction. The European Union, for example, slaps 10% on all US cars sold in their bloc, while we charge just 2.5%. The farmers also get $100 billion in subsidies yearly, dwarfing our $30 billion, letting them flood markets with cheap wheat and cheese. Meanwhile, Canada's got a 270% tariff on US dairy. Look at Vermont's dairy farms. They're now down 40% since 2000. Japan also has tariffs on rice, which hits almost 800% in order to shield their local growers, while we let their cars roll into our country with a 0% tariff tax, or we did up until now. Now, these may not be our enemies, these countries, but they have for decades waged economic warfare against the United States. And so because of this, since the 1980s, the U.S. manufacturing jobs have shrunk dramatically. From 19 million back in 1980 to 13 million jobs today. The rest of the world, meanwhile, buys far less of our goods, and we in turn are taking their cheaper products in. And there's so much more to this. Let's talk about OPEC's oil games played back in the 1970s and the 1980s that crippled our U.S. oil refiners. Saudi Arabia is still doing it now, flooding markets to kneecap our shale boom. Even allies like South Korea subsidize their shipbuilding, with their company Hyundai Heavy, which gets tax breaks that we do not match here in the U.S. Our U.S. shipyards have been dramatically reduced since the 1980s. We went from 30 major players to just a handful today. We have lost 80% of our numbers of shipyards. To give you an idea of just how bad this has become, in the 1970s, we used to churn out 70 to 75 ships per year. Now, we produce a mere 5 commercial vessels annually. We went from 5% of the global ship market to just 0.2%. All of this has dramatically hurt the citizens of the United States. Look at steel, look at automobiles, look at textile industries. They've all been dramatically damaged by this. Let's take, for example, Pittsburgh's mills. They used to employ 90,000 people back in the 1950s. Now, just 10,000. Detroit's big 3 automakers lost 20% market share to Japan and Korea since the 1990s. In 1990, there were 1.2 million jobs in this industry. They're now down to 200,000 by 2020. And the cause of this? Well, there were cheaper imports from Bangladesh, which had no tariffs from us here in the US. And Vietnam, subsidized labor, wiped all these jobs out. Wealth, my friends, has been drained from our shores for decades now, and it needs to stop. $15 trillion in cumulative wealth has been stolen from this country since 2000 alone. Think of all the things that we could have used that money for, including our massive debt. We could have cut that in half. So you might be wondering, well, how in the hell did this happen to our country? How could our leaders have let this happen? Well, see, back in the post-World War II era, so the Nazis are done, the communists are now our enemies, we bankrolled global recovery. Think Marshall Plan or the G8. Our governments back then figured that open markets would keep the peace, or at least that would be part of the puzzle. And by the 1990s, the idea of globalization became the gospel. It was just it's how it was. It's what the world was going to become. And so we decided to help everyone. We slashed our tariffs. We average now 1.5%. But everyone else did not follow our friendly gesture. NAFTA, the WTO deals, were sold to the American people as a win-win for us. And yet we were brutally left exposed. Our leaders sold the line to the American people that cheap imports would trump our industrial might. They didn't care about security. They didn't care about jobs for American citizens. It was all about keeping the peace. And meanwhile, our foes exploited it. And our friends, well, they quietly fortified their own backyards. We were used and abused all these decades, and we are paying the price for this now. Donald Trump's tariffs is aiming to flip this script, to punish the manipulators, to reward domestic grit and production. But critics say it's too late. The supply chains are global now. You've got economists at Brookings or the IMF who lean on the idea that the supply chains are now just so entrenched, so globalized, that untangling them is a pipe dream. We might as well not even try. They point to the iPhones, which has parts in 43 countries, or cars like Mexico and Canada and Japan all in the mix. And they say that reshoring to the US is too complex, too costly. But it seems to me that the decades of offshoring US manufacturing, which dropped from 25% of our GDP in 1970 to 11% now, have locked us into this web. And they argue that it's too late. Why bother? Just let the spider bite us. They'll point out that China's got the factories, Taiwan has got the ships, and you know what? We're just stuck. There's nothing we can do. But see, I think that's a load of crap. These people are either stupid or they want America to continue to decline. The fact remains that we are the United States of America, and our economy, our consumers, are the giant elephant in the room. And we have a lot to say about how all of this goes down. In 2023, the U.S. household consumption was $18.5 trillion, which is 70% of our $27 trillion GDP. That is bigger than the entire GDP of China or the EU. We are the world's biggest buyer. 25% of global imports, which is roughly 3.1 trillion, and everyone from German car makers to Chinese gadget factories depends on Americans paying the bills, swiping their cards, buying products. Walmart alone moves roughly $600 billion a year. Much of that is imported. That is not a market that you can just shrug off. If the U.S. flexes that demand, say, like with Donald Trump's tariffs, at 10% universal or 50% on China, it's not just paying for the exporters. It is a signal to these companies. We are telling industries to not sit still and wait for the governments to do something about this when the biggest customers are going to just start charging them 20% of the door. These companies will adapt. We can see this historically. Look at Japan's automakers. They built U.S. plants in the 1980s after Reagan's voluntary exports restraints. And today, Toyota's Kentucky plant churns out 550,000 cars every year. Donald Trump's tariffs today could force a return of this, a repeat, a sequel, if you will. For example, China's BYD might eye Ohio instead of shipping electric vehicles across the Pacific. Supply chains aren't static, my friends. They shift when the money moves, and we are a big player in how that money moves. These whiny, sniveling, too late people also forget that the U.S. doesn't just have cash at our fingertips. We also have huge, massive amounts of land that's available. There is incredible energy waiting to be tapped. Think cheap shale gas. If our Orwellian government and environmental nerds would just get off our backs and stop keeping it locked down. We have a skilled workforce, which China's labor costs, which is already up 300% since 2000, and the European Union's red tape just can't match. If we add tax breaks or subsidies, like for example the $52 billion from the CHIPS Act, which has already lured the TSMC to Arizona, and you will see firms all across the globe will relocate to the United States. The whiners, the complainers, the losers, the people who say that our best days are behind us, will try to say that all of these changes will happen too low for them to helm. People try to argue that it'll happen too slowly, that we won't be able to make it through. But the change is already beginning to take shape. We can see Intel, who announced building Ohio fabs by 2027. And what about the global bit, the supply chains? Sure, that's complicated, but they're not unbreakable. The COVID lockdowns proved it. When China locked down, U.S. firms scrambled for alternatives. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. jumped 20% in 2021. If tariffs hit hard enough, India, Mexico, and Canada could pick up the slack. The U.S. consumer's wallet is the point on which all rests. Tilted hard enough with tariff policy, and the rest of the world will pivot with us. If, say, we buy less from China, which was $400 billion in 2023, they will not be able to just shrug all of that off. As of right now, China has 1.5 million jobs that depend on U.S. trade. They'll either have to eat the tariffs, cut the prices, or build here in the United States. So while critics see this as a done deal, that the world is static and can't be changed, Donald Trump sees all of this differently. To him, these tariffs are just the opening act. It is the beginning of his negotiations to the rest of the world. He wants to bring wealth and prosperity back to our country, and in turn, those who decide to play fair with us first will reap massive rewards.